In this unit, we're going to have an introduction to fractions. Now, there are different kinds of fractions, but before we discuss that, you should understand what a fraction is. A fraction is part of a whole. So an example would be half. So half is an example of a common fraction, and it's possibly the most common fraction of all. Other common fractions would be a quarter, a third, a fifth, a tenth, a hundredth, 3/4, etc. Now, all of those can be written in a variety of formats, but you need to be able to write fractions and recognize fractions and manipulate fractions in these three formats. The vulgar fraction format, which is what you'd just call fraction, where it's one number written over another. That's called the vulgar fraction format. The decimal fraction format, and then the percentage format. All of those are just different ways of writing fractions. So if we take a quarter, that would be written as 1/4, or as a decimal, it would be 0.25, and as a percentage, it would be 25%. Then we'll look at what a mixed number is, then the parts of a fraction, and then making equivalent fractions. So let's begin with the different formats. I'll write them up for your reference. So if we take a vulgar fraction format, that would be one number written over another, and that is actually worth the same as the decimal fraction, which is worth the same as 25%. Okay, so those are different formats of the same amount, the same fraction. So what is a mixed number? Well, a mixed number is what it suggests, which is a mixture. A mixed number is a mixture of a whole number and a fraction. So if we make a mixed number using a quarter, you could say 2 1/4, and that would be a mixed number or a mixed fraction. This could also be written as a decimal as 2.25, and this would be called a mixed number or a mixed fraction or a mixed decimal. And as a percentage, that would be 225%. Let's now look at the parts of a vulgar fraction. This is an example of a vulgar fraction. The first thing to realize is that when you see a vulgar fraction written, there are several ways of reading this. The normal way of reading it, which is as a fraction, is 3/8. But there are other possible ways of reading it. When you see this written, it could actually be a score. For example, a score in a test, that could be 3 out of 8. It could also be read as a division, 3 divided by 8. And finally, you can read it as a description of the way it's written, which is 3/8, which you shouldn't normally do. The parts of it are as follows. That is called the denominator. The denominator is how many equal parts the whole was split into. The parts have to be equal in order for us to be able to do fractions. One small thing to point out about denominator is that it's written denominator, but it's not pronounced that way. But there's no harm in you pronouncing it denominator to help you remember the correct spelling. So that is the number of equal parts that the whole is divided into. The number at the top is called the numerator. And notice again, it's written with an OR ending but pronounced numerator. The numerator is how many of those pieces we have. So the fraction is telling us how many equal pieces the whole was split into, and out of those, how many we have. There's one more part to a vulgar fraction, and that is the line. Now the line is often horizontal, but sometimes it's slanted. So the same fraction could actually be written as 3 and then a diagonal line that way, 8. That line has a name, and that is called a division line. and it means exactly the same thing as a division sign. So what does 3/8 actually represent? Let's take a look. In order to understand what we mean by 3/8, I've taken some examples of quantities. One of them is a shape or a circle. Another is a number, and another is a quantity with a unit of measurement, in this case a distance, and we'll work out 3/8 of each one. Let's take first the shape. I like to think of it as a pizza, but if you're not partial to pizza, you can imagine it as a cake or a pie or something else round that you like. Let's first divide it in accordance with the denominator. Since the denominator is 8, I must split it into 8 equal parts. So we have 8 equal parts. And out of those 8, we actually have 3. So if this was a pizza, it would be cut into 8 equal slices, and I'm having 3/8 of the pizza. So this is how much pizza I'm having. That's 1/8. That's 2/8, which I'll point out is actually the same as a quarter. And that is 3/8. So having 3/8 of a pizza is that much, and you can see it's a bit less than half the pizza. Now let's look at what we mean by 3/8 of 320. Well, 1/8 of 320 would be 320 divided by 8, which you can do by a mental method. You can either say 32 divided by 8 is 4, so 320 divided by 8 would be 10 times as much, which is 40. Or you could say half of 320 is 160, half of 160 is 80, and half of 80 is 40. So 1/8 is 40. But we want 3/8. As you can see, 3/8 is 3 times as much as 1/8. Well, if 1/8 of 320 is 40, then 3/8 of 320 is equal to 3 times 40, which is 120. So here we have 3/8 of a shape, here we have 3/8 of a number, and now we want 3/8 of 1,760 yards. As a piece of general knowledge, I'll point out that 1,760 yards is 1 mile. So what I'm really going to work out here is how many yards is 3/8 of a mile. Well, we do the same thing that we did here for the 320 in order to get the right number, but because we're finding a fraction of a distance, the answer must still be a distance. So the answer will have yards on the end of it. So the first thing I want is to work out what is 1/8 of 1,760. So that is 1/8 of 1,760. Which again, if you practice the mental method, that will be very good for you. Half of 1,760, well, half of 1,600 would be 800, and half of the other 160 would be another 80. So 880. Half of 880 is 440, and half of 440 is 220. So 1/8 of 1,760 is 220. Once we've found 1/8 of 1,760, which is 220, to find 3/8, we simply triple 220, which is 660. But of course, that's just a number. 3/8 of a mile should be a distance. So the 3/8 of a mile is 660 yards. Let's take a look now at making equivalent fractions. We'll begin again with 3/8. Supposing we wanted to make a fraction which is equal to 3/8, i.e. it is worth the same as 3/8, but we want the denominator to be, say, 40. So the question is, what should the numerator be in order for this fraction to be equivalent to 3/8. And what we would say is that since the denominator has been multiplied by 5, we must multiply the numerator also by 5. So 3/8 is equivalent to 15/40. Let's take another example. Supposing we have this fraction, 5/7, and we want to know what the equivalent fraction would be if the numerator was 45. We'd scale up the numerator and denominator in the same way. So 5 multiplied by 9 makes 45. So we have to scale up the denominator in the same way. So that's 7 times by 9, which gives us 63. So 5/7 is equal to, or equivalent to, 45/63. Supposing we wanted to make an equivalent fraction with smaller numbers than the given number. So in other words, the denominator in the new fraction is smaller than the original. Well, here what we do is scale the numbers down. Supposing we wish to express 32/40 as 4/something. Well, the numerator has been reduced. 32 divided by 8 makes 4. So we must repeat the same with the denominator. 40 divided by 8 would be 5. So 32/40 is equivalent to 4/5. Sometimes the task that you have to perform is to reduce a fraction down to its lowest terms. Now, we've actually just done that here and here, but we did it in the process of making equivalent fractions. Reducing a fraction down to its lowest terms simply means dividing the numerator and denominator until it's not possible to reduce them any lower. Let's take an example to illustrate what I mean. Supposing we have the fraction 15/20 and we wish to reduce it to its lowest terms. What we do is look at the numerator and denominator to see what common factors they have. 15 and 20, common factors 1 and 5. We obviously would not divide by 1 because when you divide any number by 1, you still have exactly the same number. We would look to divide numerator and denominator by the highest common factor, which in this case is 5. So we'll divide 15 by 5 and divide 20 by 5. You have to divide numerator and denominator by exactly the same amount. And when we do that, we get 3/4. So 15/20 reduced to its lowest terms or cancelled down to its simplest form is 3/4. 72/90. Again, we look at the numerator and denominator to see what is the highest common factor of them, and 72 is in the 9 times table, so 9 is a factor, and so is 90. So they can both be divided by 9. And when we do that, the numerator, 72 divided by 9, is 8, and the denominator, 90 divided by 9, is 10. Now, we haven't finished because, in fact, 9 wasn't the highest common factor. However, we have reduced it. The numbers are now smaller. But we haven't reduced it to its lowest terms yet, because 8 and 10 still have a common factor that can be used to reduce them. They're both even, so they can both be divided by 2. So I will divide again. And after doing that, 8 divided by 2 becomes 4, and 10 divided by 2 becomes 5, which is 4/5. Now I'm satisfied that 4/5 cannot be reduced any lower. So 72/90 is 4/5 when reduced to its lowest terms, or when reduced to the simplest form. So note that when you're reducing, you should look at the result you get to see whether it can be reduced any further. And if it can, then continue reducing. So you can do that in 2 or even in several steps if necessary.